Tonight on Talking Politics, the state of transparency and accountability on Beacon Hill after the House voted against making committee votes public and the Senate voted to do away with term limits for the body's president. But first, is the legislature about to declare war on booze? A group of lawmakers are pushing to raise taxes on alcohol in response to a recent report out of the Boston University School of Public Health on drinking in the state. Researchers there found that alcohol was responsible for nearly 5% of all deaths in Massachusetts, and also that the income brought in by current alcohol taxes pales in comparison to the amount of money that alcohol-related care costs us. So is it time to raise alcohol taxes to cover those costs? Would that have any effect on how much people are drinking? And how likely is it that a push for moderation will gain traction on Beacon Hill? I'm joined now by the author of the report, David Jernigan, professor of health law, policy, and management, and the assistant dean for the practice at the Boston University School of Public Health, and by Mike Deehan, reporter and co-author of the daily newsletter from Axios Boston. Thank you both for being here. David, can you detail what the costs are to the state when it comes to alcohol use and abuse, and contrast those costs to the revenues that the state is currently deriving from alcohol?
Sure. The bottom line is alcohol costs the state about $841 per person per year. We take in about $11 per person per year. When you think about it on a per drink basis, every drink of alcohol consumed in this state costs us about $1.93. 77 cents of that is paid directly by government. Contrast that with the level of the tax on alcohol, which is less than a nickel a drink.
I can understand, I think, the tax piece pretty easily, but it's harder for me to wrap my brain around what the costs are that are associated with drinking. So use me as an example, because most nights before I have dinner, I have a beer. If in, let's say, 10 years, I get mouth cancer as a result of that habit, I know it's obviously going to be bad for me, bad for my family, but how is it going to cost the state of Massachusetts?
You're going to use the healthcare system more. That costs everybody. But also, I'm not so concerned about you. I'm much more concerned about the excessive drinkers who drink most of the alcohol. And that's a population that is binge drinking, that is drinking heavily. They're going to cost us not only in terms of addiction treatment, there's a huge cost from them for our productivity as a state. Not only do they have a shorter working life, this is the killer of 1 in 10 Americans of working age, but they also are less productive. The Monday morning effect, it's called presenteeism, which is people are at their desks, but they're much less effective because they're still working off the results of the weekend's drinking. So that's the biggest single thing, is the productivity effect. But you also have to take into effect everything else that alcohol touches. This is a product that affects 200 disease and injury conditions in the human body. And it has lots of secondhand effects. Drinking driving is what we're most familiar with, but domestic violence, child abuse, the list goes on.
I have to say that having read the report, when you look at the number of negative consequences that are associated with it, it's somewhat dismaying. Mike, what is being discussed right now at the legislature when it comes to creating new laws to address this? I know that David gave a briefing to legislative members last week. You said about 50 people showed up. What are they talking about doing?
Yeah, that really is where it starts, these types of legislative briefings. There's a handful of lawmakers that want to promote this report, get it into the hands and minds of their colleagues, and then kind of start working on policy from there. It's very early days for something like this, kind of a major tax change on a major institution with a lot of different players and stakeholders involved. So at the State House, this would typically maybe take a few sessions to build up. You got to get legislative leaders on your side, get a consensus majority of members, and then all of those businesses and stakeholders and medical associations, places like that. If they can build consensus, and that might come from something like a task force or a commission or something like that to kind of investigate further, then you could see maybe a modest to more than modest tax proposal end up in some kind of bill down the road. I don't think this is the kind of thing that you would see flashy headlines on. The Senate President and Speaker won't exactly say, oh, we're going to pass the booze tax bill, but tax changes do happen on an annual basis, and so this could be something, it could be months, years, decades before they act, but informing them like this through that report really is the first step.
Given how early on it is in the process, is the tax change that you've talked about, which you said could be more or less modest, would it be aimed at raising revenues to defray the costs that David identified, or would it be aimed at making the products so expensive that people consume less of them?
Right, either or both, honestly. When we talk about vice taxes, I think cigarettes really are the first thing that comes to mind. Raise the taxes, and that will be a deterrent to people picking up the habit. I don't think anyone wants to quite go that road for alcohol. Maybe they do, but I don't think that would be too politically viable. But yeah, making drinks more expensive to consume, maybe especially for younger people or people who really shouldn't be drinking, or at least drinking as much as they are, could be a deterrent, and that will improve behavior, and improve health outcomes, and improve the bottom line for the state.
I think it's important to put the tax in perspective in this state. We last raised the tax on alcohol in 1980 when Jimmy Carter was president. This is a flat tax. It's based on the volume of the beverage. How much liquid is in that 12-ounce can of beer hasn't changed in the last 40 years. So these taxes have lost 72% of their value.
Due to inflation, right?
Due to inflation. Now, I look at these as part of our prevention infrastructure, okay? We send a powerful message to young people, to the population in general, by the price that we charge for a good like alcohol. The fact that we haven't raised the tax suggests that we're failing our young people. When I was a kid in Massachusetts, the beer was a whole lot more expensive than the soda pop, the water, the milk, the orange juice. These days, you can go into stores and find that beer is the cheapest form of liquid available. That's just the wrong prevention message. Now, we can do all sorts of good things with the money that's raised, but the tax itself is part of the prevention infrastructure.
Okay, so the tax is part of the prevention infrastructure, also provides funds to deal with some of the problems that you've outlined previously. Are there other steps that you would like to see legislators take, leaving aside the question of what is, just for a moment, of what is and isn't politically viable? In your report, you talk about advertising and the regulation of advertising being a significant piece when it comes to alcohol use and abuse. You also talk about physical access to the product being important. How many bars and restaurants are serving alcohol in a given town? How many package stores are there where you can go in to get a drink? Would you like to see the legislature take steps to change the equation in those two areas?
Part of why I wrote this report is because the conversation we have around alcohol in the state, and particularly in the state legislature, is primarily a business conversation. And we needed to have a stronger public health voice at the table. From the public health perspective, there are three most effective things to do. We want to deal with the affordability, that's the tax. We want to deal with the availability, that's licensing, hours of sale, things like not repealing, not bringing back happy hours. And then we want to deal with attractiveness. On the attractiveness front, we've looked across the 50 states. There are 8 things that states potentially do at the state level to make advertising less accessible to young people, less attractive to young people, et cetera. Massachusetts does one of them at this point. In terms of availability, our licenses, the number of licenses we have in this state grew by 63%. Between 2011 and 2019.
I was surprised to see that finding because I think of the lack of licenses, particularly for restaurants and bars, as something that people are, in Boston in particular, that people are frequently complaining about. Mike, you used the word, I believe, vice or vices a minute or two ago, and I'm wondering, as we talk about the problems that David's report outlines, possible solutions to the problems, it seems to me that Massachusetts in recent years has gone in one direction when it comes to things that we might label vices. We've legalized casino gambling, we've legalized marijuana, we have now legalized sports betting. Does that shift in the zeitgeist, do you think, make it less likely that Beacon Hill will heed the warning that David is putting out there and take some sort of meaningful action in the fairly near future?
It could very well be. I think they're the competing interests here, what we have to look at politically. The public health lobby, so to speak, is very powerful on Beacon Hill, but perhaps not quite as influential as the liquor stores, the distributors, the breweries now are becoming a force as they become a bigger and bigger industry. I think that's why it's important for the public health people to keep that taxation, that revenue side of the argument in mind, and say, if you guys want to balance your books because of this healthcare cost, you have to raise the tax. But if you're anything from a liquor store owner to a bar owner to a restaurant owner, you do not want the prices of those drinks on your menu going up, and those are kind of really the competing interests that Beacon Hill has to sift through.
Let's come back to the tax and first of all, I don't think of these as vice or sin taxes. These are health taxes, okay? But let's come back to the impact of that tax. 49% of Massachusetts adults won't pay a penny because they don't drink. Of the adults who do drink, about 44% of the binge drinkers, they are exactly the group whose drinking we want to moderate. This is a much more targeted intervention than people usually think.
Okay. Let me ask you just one closing question as we kick all this around. Is it possible that your analysis missed some positive externalities associated with alcohol use? And I'm coming back here to the point that we touched on earlier. People frequently have identified alcohol licenses and the ability of a restaurant, for example, to serve beer or wine as an economic driver, something that lets that business thrive, something that has a trickle-down effect in the neighborhood by adding vitality. Are there or may there be positive effects of alcohol consumption that your report didn't pick up or not?
Far fewer than you would think. And the coverage is almost entirely about those positive effects, which is why we did the report. The public health side of this conversation has been dramatically underrepresented in the legislature, in the media, et cetera. We had to do so much legwork to pull that report together because the information about alcohol is so dispersed across the state. Our goal was to put it all in one place so that we could ground these conversations that we're having in the legislature in a greater reality about what the public health impact and the public health costs are of this product.
Well, my guess is that people watching will have a variety of different takes on the proposals that we've discussed here, but wherever you come down on it, the report really is worth reading. There's a lot of eye-opening stuff in there. David Jernigan, Mike Deehan, thank you both.
Thank you.
Next up, there's now one less check on the leadership in the state legislature after lawmakers voted to eliminate the 8-year term limit on the Senate president. The House did the same thing for its speaker back in 2015, and now, provided they both keep winning elections, the two top officials in the legislature could end up leading indefinitely. The Senate vote passed with little opposition. Just 3 Democrats and all 3 of the chamber's Republicans voted no, with one of the latter, Senator Patrick O'Connor, citing the risk of centralized power, a credible concern given Democrats' supermajorities in both chambers. All this came a few weeks after another vote on another measure intended to hold lawmakers accountable on Beacon Hill failed. That proposal, which would have made House committee votes public, was quickly shot down in a voice vote, which means we don't know which way each lawmaker voted on that either. I'm joined now by the lawmaker behind the committee vote measure, Representative Erika Eiderhoven, one of the 3 Democrats to vote against removing term limits in the Senate, Senator Becca Rausch, and Aaron Leahy, the head of Act on Mass, which works to make Beacon Hill more open and responsive to the public. Thank you all for being here. Erika, can you explain what the amendment that you proposed that was shot down would have done?
So it's very simple. It essentially would put something that the Senate actually already does, which is put committee votes online, accessible to the public, and on the website.
Why is that something that you think is important?
I think that any measure that makes our state house more accessible to the public so that they can engage meaningfully is a really important part of having a healthy democracy. And I think that, the committee votes being public, it is the tip of the iceberg of making this institution that is oftentimes so hard to engage with, so hard to understand what's going on for the average person, to make that more accessible, more transparent, and more accountable to all.
Speaking of it being hard for the average person to understand what's going on, I want to roll video of your amendment going down on the House floor that was tweeted out by Act on Mass, and then get you to just describe a little bit of what we see happen in it. So let's take a look.
Question comes on the adoption of the order, which Representative Eiderhoven offers an amendment in the hands of the clerk. Clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment number 5. Ms. Eiderhoven of Somerville moves to amend the order. in proposed rules 17B in lines 522, 523.
There be no objection, the clerk will dispense with the further reading of the amendment. The chair hears none. Question comes on the adoption of the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. The nays have it. The amendment is not adopted.
So when it comes to informing people about how Beacon Hill works, what would you point to in that video that they should take note of?
I mean, I think that this is not on the record, right? So we don't know. We have 160 reps in this chamber. We did not have to go on the record for this vote. Oftentimes that is how it happens. Of course, with certain legislation, we do have recorded votes because it's necessary and a bill is moving forward.
Yeah.
You know, there's certainly like there's certain things that are less important and, less decisive, so we do it on a voice vote. So I'm not criticizing that process. That is part of, legislative, parliamentarian process. But that's really the takeaway. And I think that, it's funny. I was thinking the other day about how, I have roll called a number of votes last session. Some people not in the legislature, even my district, are saying, oh, you're throwing a Molotov cocktail. You're like causing so much trouble. That's like a Wednesday in the Senate. You have roll calls, and it's not that they don't come with political costs, but it is really a struggle to get more transparency both in the chamber and in the committee process.
Molotov cocktail seems a little overheated, though, when you talk about asking for a roll call vote.
Yeah.
Becca, why did you vote to, or why did you not support eliminating term limits for the Senate president? Currently, Karen Spoka.
Yeah, it's not a personal thing. It's a small d democracy thing. I firmly believe that term limits are really important to small d democracy and serve a really important purpose for helping different individuals, different visions, different voices to rise in that leadership process and in the governance of our state. And so I certainly heard the concerns from my colleagues about different rules of engagement effectively, right? We have the commonly called big three, right? The governor, the Speaker of the House, and the Senate President. The other two don't have term limits, and the third one did, which can change the perceived negotiating power. And so I certainly hear and appreciate that concern. But at the end of the day, every decision we make as lawmakers is a balancing act, and for me, the balance came out this way.
And you just believe, as a matter of principle, that there should be a structure that gives rise to new leadership, new perspectives, new voices. I want to make sure I'm getting this right. As a matter of principle, you think just new blood is good, politically speaking?
I think that shifts in established leadership are useful and productive over time, right? I mean, an 8-year term limit is I think a reasonable amount of time. The fact that the folks who wrote our state constitution hundreds of years ago did not put term limits in for the governor should not, in my opinion, dictate decisions we make today in the 21st century.
Okay. Aaron, as you look at these two developments in the House and the Senate, which act on mass, both of which act on mass criticized, do you see them offering together a fundamental lesson in how Beacon Hill works? And if so, what is that basic takeaway?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was really disappointing, if not surprising. I mean, I think we all saw at least the rejection of the amendment for public committee votes coming, and once we knew it was being talked about, we all kind of saw the end of Senate President term limits coming as well. This is indicative of a problem with concentration of power on Beacon Hill, where there are just a few people that have really outsized power over the flow and passage of legislation. And the lack of transparency is, I think, really more a symptom of that than it is a cause of it in and of itself.
Do you two agree with Aaron's takeaway, since you spent time working inside the building? Is that the lesson here when we look at these two things together?
Yeah, I think I completely agree about it being a symptom of concentration of power, right? And also I think that, to me, a lot of this is about having a healthy democracy, and that our democracy is actually quite fragile, cannot be taken for granted. And when I say that, sometimes people think, I'm talking about voter suppression at the ballot box, or, the uprising of fascist movements and demagogues. But in this particular context, what I'm talking about is the lawmaking process, advocacy, and our fully funding our common good. And these are our ability and our capacity as legislators, advocates, and constituents to collectively solve our collective problems together. And so when we have a system that keeps so many people out of the process, and I think my congresswoman says it very eloquently, the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power, that's not what's manifesting on Beacon Hill in many ways. And that is not to say we don't do good things, right? With concentration of power, we have passed really good laws. But I think that we can do much better, and there's still more work to be done.
Becca, what's your take? Do you, like Aaron and like Erica, see concentration of power as I guess, the root problem here and a lack of transparency as a symptom of it?
You know, I think that there are a lot of things at play here. I'm not sure what the, cause and effect relationships might be. But I think at bottom, change is hard, right? Institutional change is hard. The Senate has taken multiple steps, both to decentralize power, right? Every Democratic member of the Senate has leadership in at least one committee, if not multiple committees, right? Committee assignments are just handed out. I will be chairing one joint committee and vice chairing 2 additional committees.
By the way, I saw that release, and I should have retained what you're going to be co-chairing, and I didn't. What's the committee that you're going to be leading?
Yeah, I will be returning to the Joint Committee on the Environment and Natural Resources, and this is an incredibly important time for that committee. I'm very excited to be returning to that post. Right, we have pretty significant work to do with regard to what I hope will be an upcoming and forthcoming environmental bond bill, because our existing one is going to expire this session. We have a huge amount of work to do on plastics and waste management, and we have some very real work to do on environmental health, particularly as it pertains to climate action and meeting our climate goals, both in 2030 and in 2050. If we don't pay attention to these other pieces, we are not going to make those goals. Right, I'll be the vice chair of the Senate Committee on Census, and also the vice chair of the Joint Committee on children, families,
so
and
as you say all that, your point being there's
not
that there is some equitable distribution of power in the Senate.
Yeah, and I, as I understand it, that change also happened over time, and to the transparency and accountability component, this was one of the things that I, when I first ran in 2018, I launched the Transparency Pledge, and more than a dozen candidates joined on, and we started getting some press coverage about it, and then it kind of manifested and went from there. And this is something that I said to my district: I'm going to be transparent and accountable to you, and I'm going to support every single roll call, and I have done that in the Senate since the day I walked in the door. And lo and behold, people started coming along, and more people started standing for roll calls. And institutional change takes time. But you see now all of this actually also predates me, but all of the Senate committee votes are published online. We are starting to see more legislators do what I do, which is to post all of our votes on our own websites regardless. Change can be slow sometimes, but I think, at least for me, I think we are seeing something of a shift.
There's a question, I think, that sort of hovers behind everything we've talked about so far, which is whether transparency and decentralized power are good in their own right, or whether they tend to yield a particular type of policy outcome. Aaron, what's your take on that? Do you see these as things that are just, as a matter of principle, we should be doing business a certain way, or do you see that openness as leading to a certain type of legislation being passed?
So absolutely, this is important on principle, right? This is about not just transparency in and of its own sake, but for democracy, right? But I do think that it does lead to different material outcomes when you're enabling more voices, diverse voices, everyday people, not just those who are kind of more wealthy or have more time in their hands or well-connected, or of course, people who can afford to hire lobbyists to advocate on behalf of their issues. When more everyday people are able to engage in the legislative process, to follow a bill from start to finish, to know what are the road bumps along the way that they need to address in order to move their bill forward, that makes us all better. And I think that is something that we really need to improve upon. I would love to bring up this study that Brown University did a few years ago. They investigated who was delaying climate action in Massachusetts. We are behind a lot of similarly blue states in terms of robust climate action. I'm so grateful for all of the work that the senator has done, and glad that you're chairing this committee again this session. But they looked at all of the data from one legislative session and found that despite the fact that over 90% of public testimony was in support of moving climate bills forward, ultimately only a few of those even made it to the floor for a vote out of hundreds. And it was way more likely that a bill that was supported by the utility lobby got signed by the governor.
So just to tease this out, is the argument that you're making here that if, for example, committee votes in the House were made public, that people who wanted to see a particular type of action taken on climate could then contact the legislators in the House who were impeding that and say, hey, come on, we need to do this differently, that it would allow them to be nudged in a way they aren't currently nudged?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. And it goes back to the concentration of power issue as well, wherein one of the findings from Brown University was that one of the reasons why climate action was so delayed is the power that leadership has over committees specifically.
Do you two agree, as people who do work in the building, that decentralizing power, creating greater transparency will yield a certain type of policy outcome, or do you have a different take than Aaron?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that those measures would necessarily generate different outcomes. I think that public engagement is a huge component of this, right? When we all are voted into office by a majority of the people who vote in our respective districts. And so certainly the more we hear from constituents, that can influence our work and our ability to advocate successfully for things that we certainly agree with, and and then can say, look, I've got hundreds and hundreds of constituents calling to me and talking to me about this. Does publicizing a robust committee vote yield that particular result? I don't know, right? People are busy.
Right, that's true.
And state government is the middle child of government, and and so we sometimes
that's a great analogy.
Don't get the. I've been using this analogy for a while, right? Local government is the youngest, and the feds are the oldest, and we're kind of the middle kid.
I love how you just made Erica totally the zoo.
That's really a great way to put it. I've always tried to describe how we're in the middle of a lot of Yeah.
Erica, I want to get your thoughts on this. Do you think that if the House did make its committee votes public, that different sort of legislation would end up coming out of the body?
I don't think it's the only thing we have to do. I think it's one, and like I said, this is where it's the tip of the iceberg of what we need to make change. I mean, just to share as an example, right, it's hard to even know what's happening in the State House if you don't have State House News Service subscription. Mm-hmm. That is thousands of dollars a year, right, that people don't have access to. There's a lot that's sort of these structural barriers in place that prevent people from engaging, getting to the State House, being able to take a whole day off of work to testify, right, being able to access your state rep. So I think there's so many pieces, right? There's not just a one solution that's going to solve everything. There's no silver bullet. So I think I see it as a very important step. But it's not the only be-all, end-all.
I do. If you don't mind, Adam, for me to just jump in on,
really quickly.
A point that the rep just mentioned, which is committee hearings have previously only been in person. This is one of the silver linings of COVID. Actually, all of our committee hearings are going to be hybrid going forward.
Which I know, and that's a good, upbeat, positive note to make us all feel a little bit better. Erica Eiderhoven, Becca Rausch, and Aaron Leahy, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's it for tonight, but do come back next week. And please tell us what you think. The email's talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics. Or you can find me on Twitter. I'm @ReillyAdam. For now, thank you for watching, and good night.